Good morning, dear friends. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Today is Yud Gimel Cheshvan, the 13th of Cheshvan, the 19th of October. We are gathered here today to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently studying Masechet Shabbat, and with Hashem's help for the final time. We are in the 8th chapter of Shabbos. Every day we make progress, Baruch Hashem. Every day, sometimes we cover more lines. Other times we go a little more in depth to cover depth of the Talmud, but there are good times to look back and appreciate our trajectory, our progress, our growth, and certainly the close of concluding another chapter is a wonderful time to do so. And so with Hashem's help, we're going to study the final mission of chapter 8. We will make a SIYUM on chapter 8. We'll begin chapter 9, and we'll talk a little bit about the connections, compare and contrast the two. And so it's a wonderful day. Thank you all for being here, those that are here in person, and those that will be joining us with Hashem's help in the future when you watch this, by watching this recording. Today, we are studying in prayerful wishes for the speedy recovery for Leah Bas Rita, and we're praying for Yosef ben Chaya. We also remember Daniel Yerachmiel ben Gedalia and Aryeh Yaakov ben Litman, and in prayerful wishes for good health for all the esteemed members of this Chabura and all the Chol Asher Lahem, their family and loved ones. So let us begin. We're going to share the screen. I'm going to hit mute, but of course, always a request that our scholars unmute for comments, questions that make this Gemara discussion so special. I'm going to have to pull up Safaria again. Here we go, Safaria, Talmud. So we're going to study the final Mishnah. Just while I pull up the page to give the intro, the final Mishnah is continuing on the subjects that we've been discussing all of this time until now. The discussion has been the value, the volume, the size, the dimensions of an item that is utterly prohibited from carrying. Generally, the principle is when it's useful, when it's commonly used and helpful at the dimension, at the size that is the very size that is not acceptable for carrying. Because when something is for a need and you so desire it and you store it and thus indicate that you desire it, that is what you're prohibited from carrying. And we've gone through a whole variety of items, liquids, materials, raw, more processed materials, hide, leather, ink, stones. That was our previous discussion. And in closing, the final Mishnah is going to mention cheres, earthenware. And of course, the question is how big, how much earthenware is helpful. In case you're getting traumatic flashbacks from the previous day's discussion of earthenware with Hashem's help, today the discussion of earthenware will strongly avoid hygiene. We'll talk about more essential uses of cheres, of earthenware. And so let us get started. Once again, this is the final Mishnah of Perek Ches, the chapter 8 on page 82. We are presently on 82a. I think I wrote 82b on the text by mistake. And actually, the end of chapter 8 flows somewhat seamlessly to chapter 9. And we'll discuss that. Cheres, earthenware. Kidei litein bein patzim lechaverai. How much earthenware is problematic? Not a whole lot. The amount that is placed between Rabbi Steinsaltz says one pillar and another. But basically in construction, occasionally we stack materials and you want to make sure that they are perfectly aligned. So we have different slats. Either we're stocking the ground or we're creating flooring or some other kind of structure, and you want to make sure that everything is perfectly flat. Today, with our machinery, there can be quite great precision in stones. But once upon a time, you needed to place filler to keep everything aligned, and they would use possibly shards or leftover scraps of earthenware to stack in between and to create equal footing, or the way Rabbi Steinsaltz explains it, to place between one pillar and another when piled on the ground to separate them. Rashi, when you organize beams and pillars and wood, and you want to stack them, and there's space in between them. Rashi says, So you want to put some earthenware to keep it exactly flat. We could imagine we're talking about pretty small shards, crushed earthenware. So according to this opinion, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda, we're talking about an incredibly small amount. Now, does anyone remember anything about Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda generally tends to be quite on the small size. He has a reputation of being quite machmir as it pertains to the question of how big of an item it cannot be carried. It's considered carrying, and he always says even a very small use, and he generally tends to take the smallest use, even if it's not super common. Rabbi Meir disagrees. Rabbi Meir Omer, Kidei lachtois by SAR. It's the amount of earthenware that is necessary to stoke fire. As we know, fire in Florida, we don't have much use for fire during most of our experience, but if you have a fire, and especially if it's, you sometimes need to stir the fire to get it going. Now, other commentaries explain this, and based on the Gemara, it's a little bit different. Perhaps we're not stirring the fire. Perhaps we are scooping up a little bit of coal. I looked around because I was curious to see the exact translation. In the art scroll, it says to pick up fire, to pick up a glowing coal. But suffices to say, we're talking about a piece of earthenware that's enough to manipulate and to mess with fire. It's going to probably be bigger than a little shard that's in between structures or boards, but also not quite that big. Rabbi Yossi Omer Kedei Lekabel by Revius. Rabbi Yossi says, you know what? You know what kind of earthenware has use? You'd keep it around, and therefore you cannot carry it if it's able to hold water. Today, we throw stuff out, disposable cups. Certainly, if something's broken, you don't use it. Once upon a time, people made use of what they had. They didn't take things for granted. It's not a criticism, just a fact of the way things were. And so you might have had a broken pot. It's not good for storing whatever it was initially used for, but you can still use it to scoop up water. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi says that it's the size that can hold the revius of water. So we're talking about a revius is not all that much. Mark, remember, what did we say a revius was?
It's it came with a 3.3 or 3.5 ounces.
So less than 4 ounces, a little more than 3 ounces. We're not talking about a whole lot of water. It's a quarter of a log, right? And imagine it's a little less than your average small size kiddush cup.
Rabbi,
Because the kid, yes,
going back to the word lachtot, so
Yes.
the word machta, it comes, was used in the Mishkan.
so a machta is usually a
It
shovel that
was
scoops
usually
coal.
to transfer coal from place to
Right.
store it from place to place.
But on the other
So-
hand, what does lachtot mean?
It's the function. It's the transference of the grammatically. I'm not very great in grammar, but it's the function. It's the action of moving either the coal around or.
So I hear your point, but I'm not certain that would be the default translation of lachatot. I believe lachatot in its default would probably be something akin to the manipulation of coal with said tool, but I'm not certain that it means shoveling to transport. Although
No, not necessarily to transport.
right, it means the manipulation of it.
Yes.
But
I'm not disagreeing. I just wanted to
Right.
make the point that it was already, a utensil was used in the Mishkan.
Yes, indeed. All I wanted to point out is that Rabbi Steinsaltz's translation says to stoke a fire, whereas other translations, I think I said Art Scroll, say it is to pick up the coal. So I just wanted to convey to you that the word lachatot, I think my default, if I wouldn't have now been tainted by seeing different translations, I would have said it means to stir or to mess with, to enhance. But now that I've seen other translations, I realized that they could both work. And for the context of our discussion, it feels better to say that we're scooping up, which is probably why Rabbi Steinsaltz and I'm sorry, not Rabbi Steinsaltz, which is why ArtScroll, as well as the Mesivta Gemara, both take the interpretation that we're scooping up a little bit of coal, because a very small thing can be used to tinker with fire, but if you're scooping something and you're holding on to it, it would have to be a little bigger. Anyways, let's continue. The Gemara is going to discuss the dimension, and so we're not done with that conversation. Doctor, go ahead. Final word.
No, the fact that he uses the word revi'it, that means volume. So if you're stirring, you don't need a volume. You're just stirring. So the fact that he uses the word revi'it, which connotes volume, it would be to pick up in some.
Oh no, yeah. Revi'it is water. So basically, what do you do with with a broken pot, with a broken shard of earthenware? Well, there are different options. You could put it in the landfill. You can throw it out, or you can keep it around and use it to the crushed pieces. You can save it till your next construction project, or you could use it to stir or mess with fire. Again, in those days, it was a necessary component of living. It wasn't like a playful thing. Or you could use it as a ladle to scoop some water to drink from in lieu of a cup. So the question is, which use determines the shiur of earthenware that can't be used? And then, just to point out, there's going to be a question in the Gemara: which dimension is larger? What is bigger? The pot that's going to hold water, or the pot that's going to stir fire? And it's not entirely certain. And it's plausible that depending on how we'll understand it, that might influence the English translation that we'll use for the word lachatot. But so we'll see that again in a moment. So we have three opinions: Rabbi Yehuda to stabilize the beams or the pieces of wood, Rabbi Meir to deal with fire, Rabbi Yossi to hold the revius of liquid. The Mishnah continues. Rabbi Meir continues and says, Afal pi she'ein raya ledavar, although this is not an absolute proof to the matter, zeicher ledavar, there is some biblical association, a reference, an allusion, or acute maybe too little. Zeicher ledavar, there is some kind of allusion to the fact, Rashi, the cheres choshev v'chatiyas or that earthenware is choshev. It's considered something of value when it's used to manipulate fire. That's the size that makes it choshev. Let's actually pop up the pasuk. Oh, what just happened?
Rabbi.
Yes.
I find it strange that they would use volume, because what I see is a little small piece of pottery, and it would make more sense to talk in terms of weight. Because how do you hold water on a shard?
Well, exactly. How do you hold water on a shard? It's a kind of shard that has enough space to hold a certain volume. Depending on what you use it for would depend on how we might describe its dimensions. If it's for scooping water, all that's relevant to know is there enough space in it? Does it have enough of a dip? Is it big enough to hold water? If you're using it to stir, then it's an entirely different configuration. But the question is, and your question is a very good one. Your question will help us understand the Gemara's question. So before we go on in the Gemara, I just want to show you a pasuk. This is a verse in Isaiah and Yeshaya. Let's go just to the beginning of the chapter for a moment. Oh, they bounced me. Okay, 30. Bear with me. So as you can imagine, this is a pasuk that's Isaiah conveying the words of Hashem, of aggravation at the Jewish people for not always being team players, not always following Hashem's words. Oh, this loyal sons, hoy, bonim soirim num Hashem, lasis etza, making plans against my wishes, weaving schemes against my will, thereby piling guilt upon guilt. As we understand, when you set out of Egypt, without asking me to seek refuge with Pharaoh, to seek shelter and the protection of all. Again, as we know, after the Dechor Beis Hamikdash, there were various escape plans, and the Jews wanted to go down to Mitzrayim, and I believe Hashem discouraged it via the Navi. And yet, they went in it. I believe that's what it's referencing. Again, I haven't freshly studied on Isaiah. I just want to see this so we see the good context the Gemara is referencing. The refuge which with Pharaoh shall result in your shame. Basically, not a good idea. Though his officers are present in Soyan, his messengers reach as far as Chanes. They as we know historically, or in Navi, the fact that Jews moved down there didn't work out. Masvi Negev. Long story short, it's trouble. For the help of Egypt shall be in vain empty. Before the Churban, also the Jewish people tried to ally themselves with Mitzrayim, also to disappointment. Now, go write it down on a tablet, inscribe it in a record that it will be with them for future days, a witness forever. For his rebellious people, faithless children who refused to heed the instruction of Hashem, who said to their seers, do not see, to the prophets, do not prophesy. Basically, the Jewish people told the true prophets, we don't want to hear your words. And then they told them, we want to hear false things, we want to hear delusions. Leave the way, get off the path. Let us hear no more about the Holy One of Israel. Assuredly, thus said the Holy One of Israel, because you have rejected this word, you placed trust and reliance in that which is fraudulent and torturous. Surely their iniquity shall work on you, like a spreading breach that occurs in a lofty wall, whose crash comes sudden and swift. Very poetic, describing a downfall that will come like a crashing wall. What will that crashing look like? It is smashed as one smashes an earthen jug. The smash is like the smash of a cheres, which is exactly our issue here. Ruthlessly shattered so that no shard is left of its breakage. Again, what would you do with a shard that's big enough to be useful? Lachtot eish miyakud, to scoop coals from the fire. Rashi, it'll be so utterly shattered that there won't be a big enough shard. It'll not be enough to scoop out a coal and along with it the fire. Kol she'ivat esh nofel balashon chitiya. Rashi tells us, whenever you are taking fire or scooping up fire, it is the word chatiya is used. So you could scoop it to stir it up, or you could scoop it to transport it. But Rashi, now we understand why. Going back to the Mishnah for a moment, why Rabbi Steinsaltz translates it. No, I'm sorry, not Rabbi Steinsaltz. Why the others translate it as to scoop. Now again, we're going back to the prophet for one more moment, and then we're done. So no shard is left of its breakage to be useful to scoop coals from fire or to ladle water from a puddle. So the pasuk uses two potential uses for scrapes of earthenware: to get fire or water. Rashi, lachsof ma'ayim lidalo, to scoop, v'chein lachsof chamishim pora v'chein cheshvei shoval dali ma'im in shvilcha. We were talking about scooping water migeve gov malei ma'im, an indent, a ditch, a puddle of water. So Hashem is talking about a devastation and using an allusion, using a mashal for shattered earthenware. Now, our Mishnah is talking about what do you do with shattered earthenware, and Rabbi Meir says we might want to take a look at the verse in Isaiah. Although again, Isaiah is not coming to teach us per se a halachic teaching, but we can infer from there about the uses and the sizes and the dimensions of chashuva use for shattered earthenware, for shards. Let's go back to Rashi. Although there's no absolute proof, there is a zecher ledavar, Rashi, the cheres, chashiv, v'chatiyat or, that a significant use of earthenware is fire. Because it says, lo yimatzeh b'michitato cheres lachtoch eish mikot. So from here we see that earthenware can be used in the manipulation of fire. So this proves, says Rabbi Meir, that the dimension that's useful is fire. Amalei Rabbi Yossi answers back and says, Misham Raya, you want to bring a pasuk to your position, that the dimension of shards of earthenware that's useful is fire. Well, do you want to just read the rest of the pasuk, says Rabbi Yossi? We also talk in the very same verse about using a shard to scoop up water. So you can't use this to prove your point. It makes both references Rashi. Interesting, by the way, just for those that like to study Rashi, it's interesting to see this where it's the same and where there are distinctions between the words Rashi uses in Yeshaya and the words that Rashi uses on our Gemara. So let's see the words. Lacha sof, lidalot, to scoop out. The Chavero, and there's other verses in Isaiah, Chashvi shoval, which have the same idea. Chashvi mayim shal hanetiva shetitztarchi la'avur hagshamim b'shviat neharot. Suffice it to say, lachasof is a word that describes the manipulation, the carrying of water. Migeva, guma, shemayim nikvatzim b'soichan. It's a puddle, a hole, an indent, a ditch where water gathers. So again, this is our Mishnah. What's the use of earthenware? 3 positions, which each imagine the useful value of earthenware. Which one is the halacha l'maisa? 3 opinions. Well, Rab Meir tries to bring a proof to his understanding, and Rab Yossi says that very same verse could support me too. That's the Mishnah. Now, the Gemara is going to have some fun with this. The Gemara is going to spend some time to figure this out. Maybe before we go on to the next chapter, if you'll remind me, we should bounce back and see the Meiri's intro, which is probably based on the Rambam's intro. So maybe, anyways, okay. Well, actually, while I'm here, just bear with me. Let's actually prepare for our SIYUM Shabbos, chapter 8. All right, here we go. The Gemara now in analysis of our Mishnah. Here is a question that the Gemara has, and Rebberal, I think this is your question too. The sages, the Chachamim of the Gemara, who were analyzing the Mishnah, had this question: Shiura that Rabbi Meir nafish, or Shiura that Rabbi Yossi nafish? Who has the bigger measure? Who is claiming that a shard is bigger? In other words, who is more makel? Who's more lenient? Who says that until a shard has a larger dimension, it may be carried, or at the very least, its carrying is not considered haitzah? Which one's bigger, Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yossi? Now, if it was utterly clear which one was bigger, we wouldn't have a question. It's a little bit ambiguous. So the Gemara says, very interesting. Mi suvara, if we were exclusively depending on our machshava, if we were exclusively relying on what we would imagine is bigger, misvara, from svara, shiura de Rabbi Yossi nafish, we would imagine that Rabbi Yossi's dimension is larger. Rabbi Yossi, I believe, is the one who says water. Yes, Rabbi Yossi. So from svara, from reason, from our own logical analysis, we would suppose that to hold liquid, you need to have a larger piece of earthenware. Before we look at Rashi, Reb Beryl, help me out over here. Why would you suppose that a piece of earthenware that holds water has to be bigger than a piece of earthenware that can stoke fire?
Well, you have to be able to hold it, to have water go and stay on it. A tiny piece.
Right. So liquids, you can't balance a liquid. The liquid has to be contained within the actual piece of pottery.
Yeah, I mean, you could see water if you leave a piece of earthenware out in the rain. I don't know.
Right. Whereas, let's say if the fire is on a coal, so the coal might be bigger in volume than the water, but the coal doesn't need to be entirely supported. Again, I'm sure there's scientific words to say what I'm saying, but misavara, we could appreciate that you need less space to hold something that's on a flame than to hold water. That's misavara. Umikra, however, with careful reading of the pasuk, shi'ora de Rabbi Meir nafish. Rabbi Meir's dimensions are larger. And now maybe this is actually the Gemara is explaining our question. The Gemara says, shi'or de Rabbi Meir nafish, I shi'or de Rabbi Yossi. A case can be made for either one. So what is the maskana? Why would the pasuk indicate that Rabbi Meir's dimensions, fire is bigger? If the water measurement is bigger than fire, so layit le b'mana zutra v'hadar layit le b'mana rabba, The pasuk is cursing. Hashem is telling the Jewish people there'll be such utter devastation, like an earthenware pot, that its shards have no use. Not only it's not going to be able to be used for A, it's even not going to be able to be used for B. To say even won't be usable for B infers that B is smaller than A. I'm sorry. That B, let's think this through. Yeah, not only it won't be available for a larger use, it'll be so utterly shattered it won't be available for a smaller use. That's how you would be able to curse someone. Not only, you tell the kid, not only you're going to be punished, you're going to have to be grounded, but I'm even going to take away all of your, I don't know. I'm just saying. So usually the second item is even more severe than the first. Maybe my analogy is not perfect. And so the Hashem is telling the Jewish people, it's going to be so shattered. Not only you're not going to be able to use it for fire, you're not even going to be able to carry water, which is even smaller. That's how you'd understand the pasuk. So again, our Gemara just explained to us our dilemma. Based on reason, earthenware to carry fire is smaller than water. Based on the pasuk, it sounds like the water is a smaller dimension.
Rabbi,
Rashi.
could we look at the pasuk again? I think
Yes, we can.
it doesn't say either or; it says both. I'm trying to remember.
Hold on, let me pull up the pasuk. The instinctive reading is, hold on, pull up a translation here. It is smashed, as one smashes an earthen jug, ruthlessly shattered, so that no shard is left in its breakage to use at all, to scoop coals or ladle water.
I could read that as both being equal.
So eventually the Gemara is going to take your position. But the intuitive reading of the pasuk is, it's going to be so not available to scoop coals, which is usually a larger piece, and even there won't even be a piece of shard to ladle water. That's how you might. That would be a common formula for the pasuk. Doctor,
the Hebrew says ve lachsof, and doesn't the translation gives you a translation to or. The Hebrew is and, so it's equivalent in the Hebrew. It differentiates it in the English. You follow what I'm saying?
That was my point. It's not
I
saying.
know. I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah.
but vav could be and it could be or, because vav is mechaber, so it could mean either or. Vav is either or, right? Usually it does mean and but it's they're both appropriate translations. Again, I have no agenda to defend this translation. I'm not sure if you would give me this pasuk. I'm not certain I would write or. I probably would write and.
Rabbi,
but I'm just yes.
I could read the pasuk the same if the two items were reversed. That's why to me it's equal.
You're saying you could fathom a scenario where it says there'll be no shards left to ladle water or to scoop coal or and to scoop coal.
Yeah,
but ultimately,
they put water first. It doesn't matter. They're not comparing.
Ultimately, usually the formula, if you're giving a consequence, is it's going to be, what's the word? It's going to be escalate.
Rabbi, only if the word is or and not and. If you
Not
say
true.
I'm going
Not
to do
true.
this and that.
Ultimately, why would you choose to place one before the other? So common communication would be that you would escalate or increasingly harsh consequences.
Rabbi, let's do it positive. Sasan v'simcha. Is simcha greater than sasan?
Okay, now you're getting a little bit too complicated. Possibly we have to analyze the meaning of sasan and simcha. Suffice it to say, if you have to choose in a situation of a consequence, and you're going to list two different consequences, it's reasonable. It stands to reason that it's going to escalate. It's going to get worse. Not only you're not going to have a shard that's big enough for this, you're not even going to have a shard that's good for that. That is the Gemara's understanding of a common biblical formula for a prophet giving a toichecha. Take it or leave it. But that's how the Gemara understands it. This is the Gemara's logic, not my own logic, but I'm fairly comfortable embracing the Gemara's logic. Now let's read Rashi. So this is a challenge of sorts to this thing. Based on the words of the rabbis, you would infer Rabbi Meir Machmir. Rabbi Meir is more strict. Amar lachtois by or v'loi pirish shiura v'cheres porta chazi lechada gacheles. A little scrap of earthenware could be good enough for holding one coal. V'ilo the kabel revius mayim nafish shiura. So Rashi explains that no measure is given for the fire, and so we can infer that we're talking about the smallest, a scrap of fire. Whereas when it comes to water, we're provided with a measure, a revius. So based on that structure, so Rashi is explaining it a little different than I explained it. Rashi says, you know what svara means? Simple. Look at the words. Rabbi Yossi gives an amount. Rabbi Meir gives no amount. But when you look at the pasuk, lachsev mayim zuter, it's clear, as they says Rashi, that the water is a smaller amount. Because if you need a larger piece of earthenware to carry water, then the curse would be that you're not going to find even a small use. And then he says, oh, you'll even find a bigger use? You're not going to find even a small use. And then he says, Doctor, I'm sorry, I just hit mute because for some reason I was hearing my voice. So this is the Gemara again. Whose shear is bigger? Whose shear is bigger? Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yossi? The structure of the Mishnah sounds like Rabbi Yossi was a bigger dimension, but the pasuk clearly points the opposite. Amar Abaya. Abaya says we're compelled to understand that when we talk about fire, we're not talking about a small coal. We're talking about lachtois eish mikida gedola, to stoke out, to get some fire out of a very big fire. Rashi, the kamar Rab Meir lachtois or mikida gedola kamar shafilu gachelas ktana in a roy lachtois ba'el becheres gad b'neishu nichva. If you have a big fire, you need a long big piece to dip it in without getting burnt. So it's not only the question isn't only how much fire you're going to get on your spoon or whatever on your coal, but it also depends on how big the fire is. So Abaya says, although I might have thought that the fire should be smaller, but the structure of the pasuk and indeed the Mishnah supports that Rabbi Meir is a bigger measure because we're talking about manipulating fire with a very big. Or manipulating a very big fire, and therefore you need a bigger piece of coal. Rabbi. Okay, so what does the Gemara explain? That indeed, although to scoop the smallest amount of fire, you could use smaller shard for fire than for water. But what our Mishnah intends to say is that one measure, Rabbi Meir's measure, is to manipulate a big fire. And Rabbi Yossi is talking about just the revius of water. We've managed to explain the Mishnah to say, and we've explained according to Abaya that Rabbi Yossi's measure is smaller, and Rabbi Meir's measure is bigger. Rabbi Yossi's measure is smaller, and that's how Abaya explains the Gemara. Now let's go back to our Mishnah. Rabbi Meir wants to prove his point by quoting the pasuk that says that you won't even have a shard left to stir fire. And Rabbi Yossi says, Misham Raya, you think you're able to bring a proof from the pasuk? Read the end of the pasuk. The end of the pasuk says that a very valid chashiva use for an earthenware shard is for water too. The Gemara says, Shaper ka'amar le Rabbi Yossi le Rabbi Meir. Indeed, Rabbi Yossi's retort was a good defense. Rabbi Yossi holds his own, and indeed proves that it's reasonable to say that his shear is correct. The amount of earthenware to stoke, to hold water is a measure too that is a good use, and therefore you shouldn't be able to carry it even at that use. And again, as we established, it's smaller than Rabbi Meir's opinion. However, and Rabbi Meir is going to make your point. The Gemara says Rabbi Meir read the Mishnah like. Actually, let me see this. Rabbi Meir loy mivayi kamer. What did Rabbi Meir? How did Rabbi Meir read the pasuk? Loy mivayi midi dechashiv leinshi deloy l'shtakach le. Not only the common use will be unavailable. You're even going to find a use that no one thinks to use it for. So Rabbi Meir says This pasuk doesn't teach us that it's reasonable to scoop water with an earthenware shard. Who in their right mind drinks water with a broken piece of a dish? Our pasuk is saying not only won't you be able to use a normal use, you won't even find a terribly abnormal use. So Rabbi Meir reads the pasuk and says, you see, the reasonable use is the first item, and that's to stoke fire. And therefore, Rabbi Meir sees this pasuk as proof to him. But Rabbi Yossi says, no, you're reading the pasuk wrong. It's presenting two different uses, and my use is a chashav use. And therefore, says Rabbi Yossi, you cannot carry a coal, you cannot carry a shard that's going to be able to carry water. Rashi afilu midi lechashiv, k'yilachsev mayim lelishkacha bo le'olam lechashiv she'olachtes ar. Hadron Allah chamoitze yayin. Here's where the fireworks go off. My dear friends, congratulations. This has been a fun chapter. It's taken us places we never imagined, but Baruch Hashem, with Hashem's help, He's brought us to the point where we've concluded the 8th perek, the 8th chapter of Maseches Shabbos. And my dear friends, you ain't seen nothing yet. The best and brightest conversations and subjects are ahead of us. And so Mazel Tov, thank you to the dear, dedicated members of this Chabura, who day in and day out, notwithstanding busy schedule and construction and leaks and no elevators and cold and hot and quarantines and everything in between, we do our best. We meet up every day, and the people on here and their households who possibly put up with and enable it deserve a big yasher koyach. And again, Hashem should give everyone vast brachas of good health and brachas of strength and brachas of eyesight to see what's happening on the screen and everything in between. So thank you, and l'chaim. Dr. Stalmer, did you say that we should really be serving nash today? Is that what I understood the text? There should be a kiddush. So everyone is invited to go find locally sourced alcoholic or non-alcoholic beverage and give yourself a toast. Congratulations. This is not a simple matter. It's a big day and a special day worthy of celebration. Momo, are you here?
Rabbi, now that we've get into these details, what's the minimum amount of alcohol within the beverage to make kiddush?
You're asking a very good and actually complex question. In the celebratory nature of this moment, we'll go on a slight detour as we say l'chaim. There's actually a big shaila, because really you should make kiddush on wine, the most prestigious drink. But there's a question about if you're going to make kiddush on another beverage, are there other dimensions? And so there are many Jews, and you've probably seen this, if they'll make kiddush in the daytime on schnapps, on bronfen, they might make kiddush on a smaller cup, because although the serving size of wine is a revius, not everybody comes from a country in the world where you drink a full revius in one gulp of mashka. So many people will make kiddush on a smaller shot glass. But there are those that don't. Chabad actually, I believe, has a preference. If they're going to make kiddush, maybe this has to do with the way they would drink alcohol in Russia. I don't know. But if they make kiddush, they would probably also want to have a revius, not just a little kelishkla. But many Jews, you'll find fine Jews and good Jews make kiddush. So as far as what is the dimension of making a l'chaim, I don't know. Probably enough to make a bracha achrona. L'chaim, dear friends. Thank you all for being here and for sharing in this special moment, concluding another perek in Maseches Shabbos. L'chaim, l'chaim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol v'yah b'dvar.
Amen.
If you would come to Montreal, a revit would be nothing. They go by the bottle.
Now we are going to start a new chapter. And this is a chapter that makes everyone confused. And being confused is not a bad thing if ultimately we can come to make sense. I want to read for you the Mishnah. And then I'm going to ask you if there's a glaring question. And we'll see how Rashi resolves the question. And maybe we'll go and look at how the Meiri resolves the question of Tosfos or the Rambam. But let's get started. New perek 9, chapter 9. Let's see if I'll remember when we start tomorrow that we're in chapter 9, page Pei Beis, Amud Aleph, 82a, and then with Hashem's help, turning the page to 82b. Amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva taught, Minayim avodah zara. How do we know that idol worship stuff shemitame b'masa kenida conveys ritual impurity like the ritual impurity of a nida. How do I know this? Shenamar, there's a pasuk that says, let's pop open this pasuk. It's familiar because it's in the same chapter that we just read of Isaiah, which may already be an answer to some of our questions. Here, let's read the pasuk in the English here. Chapter 20, I think it is, right? Chapter 22. So again, this is the same chapter. The Navi is admonishing the Jewish people for not listening to Hashem, for seeking out Egypt, for their idolatrous practices, the fall of Jerusalem. And you will treat as unclean the silver overlay of your images, the golden plating of your idols. You will cast them out like a menstruous woman. Out, you will call to them. Avodah Zarah, cast out like a nida. Say dava. I know this invokes a lot of uncomfortable imagery. But I want to hold off in a moment on addressing it and first see what the pasuk is saying. And so rain shall be provided for the sea. So I believe what we're saying is that here, let's go back just for a moment to see the context. Truly, Hashem is waiting to show you grace. He will arise to pardon you. Hashem. So the first half was very sharp admonishment, but a reminder that Hashem embraces the Jewish people. Indeed, Am b'tzion yeshev Yerushalayim, the people dwell in Jerusalem. You shouldn't have to weep. Hashem will grant you his favor. I will respond as soon as he hears it. Hashem will provide for you meager bread and water. You'll no longer be ignored. Your eyes will watch and be your guide. Whenever you deviate to the right or the left, your ears will heed the command from behind you. This is the road, follow it. Basically, the Jewish people should seek out, follow Hashem, follow the Torah. And part of doing the right thing will be casting out Avodah Zarah, casting out your idols, silver and gold, cast them out, and you will call to them. So this is the pasuk. Now let's go back to the Gemara. So we have a pasuk which compares Avodah Zarah to a nida. Forget the poetic imagery, which is a little bit jarring, and God willing, I'll share something in a moment. But first, the halachic matter. Rabbi Kiva says, "Manida metama b'masa," just as a person that is in a state of nida can convey a certain type of impurity by carrying. Avodah Zarah metama b'masa, the same thing. Avodah Zarah stuff conveys impurity even when you carry it. What does masa mean? So masa here means, usually we imagine that ritual impurity is conveyed by direct contact. You touch a sheret, you touch a critter that conveys impurity, and one becomes impure. You touch a mitzorah, let's say. I'm not trying to get into the specifics of mitzorah because it's actually a lot more complicated. However, there are certain kinds of people that or types of ritual impurity that are conveyed even if there is not direct contact. For example, if a person carries something, even if they're not touching it, let's say you're carrying a tray and on the tray is a shot glass and on the shot glass is an olive, I don't know. Well, you didn't directly touch it, but you could still convey the kind of ritual impurity of Anita. Now, by the way, nowadays, aside for today, there isn't much practical implication for if something contacts Anida or a sheret or anything else. The implication of Anida today is if a couple is intimate or together, but aside for that, there isn't much implication. But certainly in ancient times, the times of the Mishnah, the times of the Gemara when the Jews lived in Israel, so then laws of ritual impurity were of great significance. And the Chazal are telling us that just like if a person endeavors to keep their food or their items tahar, well, Avodah Zarah can convey ritual impurity, even absent direct contact, just by carrying it. Rashi b'masa adam hanoisa. If you carry it. This is the Mishnah. The Mishnah tells us a law about Avodah Zarah. Now, what kind of Avodah Zarah? So we could just look. Rabbi Steinzel says a statue of a deity. Anyone besides for specific micro questions? Does anyone have a macro, a grand question at this Mishnah? Any questions that arise? There's no wrong answer. But I just like to hear if any question arises when we read this Mishnah.
But if there wouldn't be the word statue that Reb Steinsaltz adds, I would say people today worship all kinds of crazy things.
Okay, fair. And Be'ezer Hashem, perhaps we'll go a little bit further into the specifics of Avodah Zarah and what we mean when we say Avodah Zarah. Good question, good comment. Any big scheme questions here? Any Masechet Shabbos related questions?
I think they're always picking on the women. They're talking about the soita.
I said I'll share my thoughts in a moment, but I first want to talk macro.
Well, Rabbi?
Yes, doctor.
In terms of Nida, what comes to mind immediately has to do with mixed swimming, with women going into a swimming pool, from women going into a swimming pool, and there are men in the swimming pool. And so what's the issue there? Okay,
that's an interesting question. I don't believe, and again, I may be totally off because I haven't studied that. It's a good question. I don't believe ritual impurity, assuming that it is a concern, is conveyed by two people being in the same pool of water. But in addition to that, there is no concern as far as a person coming in contact with a person that is ritually impure as a nida. There is not a problem unless in Jewish law they are a husband and wife, which then of course, I mean, there are other problems because maybe generally people, according to halacha, people of opposite gender are regulating what kind of contact they're having without getting, beyond that. But I'm waiting for another question. Professor, perhaps you're.
What is he doing carrying anything if it's Shabbos?
Right. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Professor.
We are talking about Shabbos. You cannot carry anything at all, not just items of idolatry.
So the professor asked the question: if it's Shabbos, and I'm gonna use your question to reframe the question and to say the big question, Professor, because your question infers that you're already moving past the question. The professor's question is: you can't carry anything on Shabbos. Man dechar shmei. Who are we talking about Avodah Zarah? The professor's question assumes the thing that triggers my question, which is: what does this Mishnah have to do with Shabbat at all? We were talking about Shabbos, and we've been advertising, and every time you look at a set of Shas, of Talmud, you see the second tractate is Shabbos, and then there's a Mishnah, which is like from totally out of left field. Did we by mistake open the wrong link in Sefaria? Are we studying a Mishnah that's in the tractate of Avodah Zarah? Why is Masechet Shabbat talking about the status of the ritual impurity of Avodah Zarah? It's interesting, it's important, but how did it fall into this chapter? That's the big question.
Because maybe the measurements that we've been talking about of different materials, whether it's wood or leather or whatever, can, in their own way, be symbols of Avodah Zarah.
No, but
so
also we used a size that would incur impurity on some things, big enough that it would be impure. I think that was some criteria somewhere.
So the doctor is giving an interesting and I think correct comment, which is that there's some kind of continuity between chapter 8 and chapter 9. Chapter 8, although we talked about Shabbos, we were talking about dimensions and what it's worth and what it means and what it's considered. And so thematically, it's not entirely off. I mean, although it's not talking about Shabbos, but it's not beyond reason that we continue talking about the status of stuff. Is it good? Is it bad? Does it have it? So that's a possibility. I want to take a fast look at Rashi first, because Rashi asks this question too. And Rashi gives a surprising answer. Not everybody embraces Rashi's answer, but I want to show you Rashi's answer. He says, Amar Rabbi Kiva minayin la'avodah zarah. So Rashi, many times, and we find this in Chumash too, Rashi doesn't always specify the question. Many times Rashi knows that you have a question and starts with the answer. So he goes like this, because eventually following this conversation, the Mishnah wants to teach us a question. How do we know that although typically many malachas are prohibited, many of them are waived for the child that's going to have a circumcision? So it also brings a series of other Mishnahs that are very familiar. So now I want to do I want to open up the Mishnah, and we may be stuck with a question. I mean, I gave you an answer. Rashi says that there's a theme. The end of the Mishnah is going to talk about Shabbos, and so it goes on a series of similar teachings. That's Rashi's answer in a nutshell. I want to take a fast zoom through this chapter 9, the Mishnahs, just to see what Rashi's talking about. If we have time, we'll then take a look at Tosfos, or if not, we'll resume tomorrow.
Rabbi,
So here, hold on. Yeah, go ahead. Fast.
Didn't we somewhere have a definition of minimum that could transmit impurity on some of the things?
We did, not recently, but that is true. That is true. There are shiurim. There are measurements of what can convey impurity. The interesting thing, though, is that we didn't necessarily make that assertion in the context of Avodah Zarah. Let's go faster the Mishnah. I want you to see what Rashi's talking about, and then if we have time, we'll continue. Amar Rabbi Kiva, question number 1. How do I know that Avodah Zarah is ritually impure? How do I know that a svina, that a boat is ritually pure? Brings verses to prove it. Next Mishnah Gimel. How do I know that a peleta shechva zera, another kind of impurity, is an impurity? And it brings other psukim. How do I know that a sicha, that smearing oil, is problematic on Yom Kippur? Mishnah 5, Hamoitzi Eitzin, carrying wood, certain measures can combine for the laws of Shabbos. Pepper, a certain amount, Shabbos. A merchant's basket, Shabbos. Hold on. I'm sorry. I skipped through the Mishnah. I wanted to show you one second. Hold on a second. I think I went too far.
If you get to the end, Rabbi, we can have another l'chaim, so don't worry.
Yeah, we're almost having another siyum. I'm sorry, I skipped through the Mishnah. Hold on. The Mishnah that I skipped through is the Mishnah that I wanted to be in. Minayin shemachitzin esamila b'yayim hashlishi shecholes b'Shabbos. How do you know that you wash the circumcision, a child that was circumcised? How do we know that we treat the child on Shabbos? And it brings the pasuk. So Rashi says this series of Mishnahs, Aleph, Beis, Gimel, and actually Dalet, I believe. The first 4 Mishnahs are mostly not about Shabbos, but they take on it. It's a certain series of teachings that come as a unit, and it's a series of isolated ideas, but they all have in common is a certain formula of being inferred from Sukkim. And so Rashi says, being that this unit needs to come together, and it ends essentially with the discussion of Shabbos, Marchitzin Asamila, washing the circumcision on Shabbos. So therefore, our Mishnah, the format of the Mishnah is not unheard of that we might take a small detour if ultimately its objective is to get us to a destination about Shabbos. That's what Rashi answers. So Rashi says basically, you had a question, what does Avodah Zarah and its ritual purity status have to do with Masechah Shabbos? Rashi says, good question. The answer is has nothing to do, but it's a certain series of topics which lead to a Shabbos related question, and therefore it belongs here. That's essentially what Rashi says. I have to close now, but I just want to show you that Tosfos has another answer, and then God willing, the Meiri on the Mishnah also has something to share. And so with Hashem's help, tomorrow we'll continue this question, and we'll make sure that we got our Mishnah straight, and we'll continue our journey through the Talmud. I want to again thank all of you for being here for this.
You make enough l'chaims, everything will become clear.
Let's see.
Anyways,
thank you all again. L'chaim. Have a wonderful day. Shkoyach, and Mitzvah tomorrow we'll continue our journey through the entire Talmud, making sense of the first Mishnah, and we'll get into the Gemara. Have a wonderful, blessed, and healthy day. And Yashikoyach all Mazel Tov for the SIYUM on the 8th chapter. Take care.